While I was preparing this programme today, I was thinking back, actually over the last 70 years of Scotland's recent history since World War II, to look at how support for independence has grown throughout this long period. 70 years is a long time. But what's interesting about it is that in researching this programme, I've discovered that Scotland's voters have actually voted in majority for home rule, for one thing, more times than you might expect, as well as obviously having the referendum in 2014. To just refresh your memory, and for those younger viewers of this programme who may not be aware of our more recent history, after World War II, 1949, 1950, certain startup organisations in Scotland which were looking at sovereignty as an issue for Scotland and the possibility of obtaining some limited self-governance within the United Kingdom, asked Scottish people to sign a covenant. And in the covenant, there was a request for the United Kingdom to grant Scotland the ability to govern itself within the framework of the United Kingdom. Effectively what we have at the moment, in fact, self-government within the larger framework of the UK. Now, at the time, 2 million Scots actually signed this covenant. Now, that was well more than 50% of the population back then. Remember, our current population of around 5.5 million people was not always at this level. Certainly post-World War II, it would have been much lower. So 2 million people was a substantial majority of the Scottish voting public who were in favour of this. And yet, of course, the United Kingdom government was never, ever going to give that any kind of debating space at all within Westminster. So that didn't happen. And then, of course, more recently, if we jump forward in time to 1979, when there was a referendum on home rule again, a majority of Scots voted for a Scottish Parliament, again, working within the framework of the United Kingdom, so not independence. And it was a majority again. But this time the United Kingdom decided to apply a new rule, which said that they had to have a basic turnout above a certain level. And because that threshold hadn't been reached, they ruled the majority null and void. And so that attempt at home rule failed. And then, of course, we jump forward in time to the time of Alex Salmond and the referendum in 2014, at which Scottish sentiment in favour of independence, as recorded by the polls a few days before the actual vote was taken, was over 50%. It was actually at one stage 51%. That obviously spooked the United Kingdom and sparked the famous Daily Record hoax vow, which was a fake load of promises concocted by newspaper boss Murray Foote, who later became the chief of communications for the SNP and has recently retired or resigned from that position. So again, we were denied independence on the brink of having a majority for it. Now, you might have thought, well, that was the end of the story, and we all remember how we felt on the 19th of September when we found out that we'd lost. However, it wasn't the end of the story, because in 2015 there was a UK general election. And the angry Scottish voters who believed that they had a majority for independence and had been duped out of it by a fake newspaper hoax were so angry that they actually voted out virtually all of the unionist parties of MPs in Scotland, taking the SNP taking 56 out of the possible 59 seats available at Westminster. Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister during the period in the 1980s, had famously said on record and in her own memoirs that all the people of Scotland needed to do in order to get independence from the rest of the UK was to obtain a majority of MPs at Westminster. Now, this they clearly did by a huge margin. And this, I think, was possibly an angry reaction by the voters of Scotland, the pro-independence majority, at having been basically diddled out of their 2014 referendum victory. So it was a reaction to having been conned in 2014. However, the Thatcher doctrine was just swept aside by the United Kingdom government, who said, oh, that doesn't apply at all, despite what the Prime Minister said in print twice and in public. So the Thatcher doctrine was fake, it seems. But again, it wasn't the end of the story, because as you know, as we all know, back in 1997, not because of the Labour Party incidentally, but because the Council of Europe, and remember we were in the European Union as part of the UK at the time, the Council of Europe insisted that the United Kingdom needed to define how the four parts of the United Kingdom were governed. And that meant they insisted that Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales should all have their own devolved administrations, or governments if you want to call them that. And that of course led to 68% vote of the Scottish people for Home Rule and the reconvening of the Scottish Parliament, which we all know so well today. And that, you would have thought, might have been the end of the story. We managed to get at least part of what the people of Scotland actually wanted, which was the ability to rule ourselves and not have to take orders from London. But of course that wasn't the end of the story, because along came Alex Salmond, and in the early part of this century swept into power, and in 2011, 2012 declared that there would be an independence referendum in 2014. Even got then Prime Minister David Cameron to agree that if there was a yes vote, then independence would follow. And of course we all know what happened with the fake vow and Murray Foot, and that's all history now. But even that was not the end of the story, because that was then followed in 2015, as we know, by this European Union vote, where we all voted to stay in the European Union, and yet didn't stay in the European Union, despite every region of Scotland voting, well over 60% of us, in favour of staying within the European Union. What do you know? David Cameron has a referendum and England votes to leave the EU and drags everyone else kicking and screaming with them. And that brings us up to roughly where we are today. And you might have thought, well, we might as well give up now, because the era of Salmond has come to an end. I mean, his funeral is happening, I think, on the 29th of this month, a private family funeral in his hometown. You might have thought that draws a line under all independence campaigning as a result, because Nicola Sturgeon, it now appears, and I've been hearing rumours from various sources today, that she might, and this is only a rumour, she might have separated from her husband and might now be living with another woman. Who knows if this is true or not? It might not. But certainly Alex Salmond now, his era has come to an end, and many of us are starting to feel a bit hopeless about the future. But what we need to remember here is that support for independence has not gone down. Just because British polls say that it's wedged at 50% isn't an indication of anything in particular, because British polls always say that independence support is stalled at 50%, because that makes you give up. And that is the entire point of British newspapers and their polls, is to make you think that you don't have the support you need to win. But that leaves us just one further opportunity to exercise this current majority that we have, and I believe that it's probably well over the 50% mark. At one point, a few years ago, in fact, I think about a year and a half ago, at one point independence support had soared way up to 58%, and somehow magically it's all deteriorated back to 50% in the British polls. I suspect that that support is still there. It's just the newspaper polls have been designed to massage it a bit so that we don't think that we have a winning hand. But we do have this big opportunity in 2026 to do something. You know that Salvo is working on the legal issues of self-determination with the International Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, and so on. That is going on in the background, but while that is happening, we have a parliamentary election of our own for Holyrood coming up in 2026. And I think, to be honest with you, unless the SNP is chucked out of office by a substantial majority of us voting for another pro-independence party, I don't see how anything will change. So we have a choice to make here, and I think people who have traditionally voted for the SNP might have to think about this as well. Do they continue to support this ridiculous policy of voting SNP in the first and second votes, which allows in at least half of the, or just under half of the remaining seats in Holyrood to be taken usually by the three unionist parties of England? Or do we do something different? Now, there's something different we could do is if, and this is a huge if, but if ALPA and the ISP and the SSP and any other small independence parties or independence candidates all got together and formed a new alliance for independence to oppose the SNP politically, but not, what would you say, not ideologically, but to oppose them so that we can get some more courageous and more bold politicians into Holyrood, so that the legislation can be passed that will enable a new referendum to be held, because we know that England is never ever going to allow another referendum on Scottish independence. They didn't do it back in the 50s, they didn't do it in the 70s, they nearly didn't do it in 1997, and we only have the Council of Europe to thank for that one. But now that we're out of Europe, we don't have that backup anymore. And this is why getting the support and the ruling from the international courts is so important to what happens next. But we really need to think the unthinkable and think about voting for another pro-independence party other than the SNP, so that we can actually create a government which will legislate for another referendum and which will have international backing to hold it. Because unless we do that, it's been shown in history that the only time we actually succeeded just in getting home rule was when we had some pressure applied from the Council of Europe, an outside international body representing all the countries and the leaders of Europe. Without that, we wouldn't even have our Scottish Parliament to talk about, and we wouldn't be able to have the elections in 2026. So that external pressure and the external legal backstop of international law is going to be essential to what happens next. Anyway, just trying to bring us up to date. If I've got any of these facts wrong or in the wrong order, I apologise, but there's an awful lot of history here to think about. But all of it's pointing to one thing, and that is that support for independence was way above 50% even in 1950. The subsequent years, when the United Kingdom shut down all discussion of it until the SNP appeared on the scene, was an indication of how desperately they didn't want to lose Scotland. And that was before anybody discovered or even thought about oil. Now the oil and the gas are there, and the renewable energy is there. England is going to fight even harder to prevent Scotland from leaving than they did before. And this is why it is us, the people, who need to take the action. But the politicians on the independence side of this argument need to seriously consider how best to get a government into Holyrood which will have an independence referendum with the backing of the international courts, possibly the United Nations, and possibly European Council leaders again. But all of these things have to happen. But we are the ones who need to change our politicians, and that's now our job, and we have got just under 2 years to get this done. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. I thought it'd be an interesting thing to take a little walk down memory lane over the last 70 years, just to see how support for independence has not gone down, but has stayed solid throughout 70 years, despite the best efforts of the United Kingdom to suppress it. It's impossible for the UK to kill an idea of freedom. They tried it with their other colonies and they failed. They lost them all. Scotland is the last big industrial, resource-rich colony that the United Kingdom still has. In recent days, it's been revealed that the United Kingdom has had to sign a defence deal with Germany in order to patrol the skies over Scotland to prevent Russian bombers from passing overhead and making incursions into our airspace. And it shows you just how weak the United Kingdom has become internationally when they're having to do deals with their former friends in the European Union after deliberately leaving it. They're having to go back cap in hand and ask the Germans to help them out in detecting Russian planes. That's not a good sign for a country that says it's, fifth most wealthy country in the world. I don't think that's the case anymore. And with the climate catastrophe looming in the next 21 years and the potential collapse of the marine ecosystem being now projected to happen at that point, do we really want to be going down with a sinking ship at the point where we really need to start working harder to make sure, A, that we're self-sufficient, and B, that we can survive whatever climate catastrophe seems to be coming down the tunnel towards us at the moment. Anyway, that is my argument for today. I hope you've enjoyed the little history tour down memory lane. But remember, it's up to us now, and we need to start putting pressure on political parties to form alliances that can challenge the hegemony of the SNP, which has held power for so long and has now spent the last 10 years stalling independence, because that is the only way you can interpret what has been going on. So it's time for a change. Anyway, keep the faith, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.